And this is just going to be me giving you a quick talk through of the slideshow in case there's any weird words, concepts, or anything I feel I really need to say. So, we're doing animals in this topic, obviously. Just covered plants. So, Animalia includes a lot of things, obviously. Animals are multicellular, eukaryotic, heterotrophs. So they are obviously going to be more complex than your single-celled organisms we covered already. Eukaryotic, so these are true cells with all the organelles that we've talked about. And heterotrophs, they don't make their own food. They're going to have to consume preformed organic molecules and no cell walls for them. Now the diversity continues from there. So there's two basic kinds. You have your vertebrates and your invertebrates. Vertebrates are going to be the ones that have bones and a backbone and an internal skeleton overall. Invertebrates, not so much. Their skeleton's going to be external, and so they are going to be pretty distantly related to anything that we're familiar with, really. So, they said they were heterotrophs. That means they eat other organisms. They respire. Everything respires. You need to get energy from the food you eat. Doesn't matter if you're single-celled, multi-celled, plant, or animal. You're going to have to carry out respiration, and animals do this. They're aerobic respiration. So they take in oxygen and give off carbon dioxide. Being multicellular and more complex organisms, now you're going to have a more complex circulation system. And the more complex and large the organism, the bigger and more involved the circulation system is going to be, because every single cell has to be served by that circulatory system, because every single cell needs nutrients, it needs ingoing energy sources, and it needs outgoing waste. So you're going to have that circulation everywhere. So excretion, there you go. You got to get rid of things like ammonia and carbon dioxide and all the waste products of cellular respiration and life, dead organelles and whatnot. Response and movement. So living things, one of the things that makes it a living organism is it's going to respond. It's going to be able to respond to stimuli in its environment. Could be temperature, could be salinity, saltiness of the water, could be oxygen content, water content. I mean, there's lots of possibilities here, but it's going to respond to stimuli. And most of them can move, though there are sessile or non-moving animals. And reproduction. Most reproduce sexually, though sometimes it gets complicated where they can be both genders at the same time and things like that, but sexual reproduction is generally the way to go. Now, with living things, there's a couple of different body forms that you're going to run into. Not everything is designed the same. When we inevitably, someone will bring up extraterrestrial life and aliens and whatnot. And more often than not, people want to envision aliens as being set up like humans, and that's just a silly thing to do, quite honestly. We walk on two legs, we walk upright, we have symmetry. We have a left side and a right side that are essentially identical. There's no reason that's better than other formats. So in the animal world, we generally run into something with no symmetry, possibly. Or if it has symmetry, this is pretty similar to a math thing. You can have radial symmetry, or you can have bilateral symmetry. Radial means that if you draw a line through the center of the body, there's a left side and a right side, and it's the same on either side of it. You can see the images down below getting at what I'm talking about. And then there's bilateral symmetry, where you can only have one line that does it. See, radial, you could have that plane were the same, or that plane, or that plane. Up here, we got the same example. Bilateral, there's a left side, right side. You can't divide like front to back and have symmetry. It's only straight down the middle for human beings. Bigger picture is better. So you can see bilateral symmetry, left side, right side of our lobster. And this one, yeah, the radial symmetry. You can't just draw one line down it, but you can draw several different ones where you'd have similar sides. Cephalization. Now, there's a word you don't say every day. anything that has a C-E-P-H-A-L, that beginning, it's talking about head. It goes back to, again, ancient languages we don't use anymore, but that is a prefix that tells you to talk about head stuff. So it's a tendency for sense organs to be grouped into the anterior or head end of the organism. It doesn't have to be that way, but that is a pretty dominant tendency of more complex life forms here on planet Earth. So if you think about it, doesn't matter if it's a puppy or a butterfly or an eagle or a horned lizard, a whale, whatever it might be, most of the sense organs are up front. Not to say all of them are. For certain, there are senses you can have elsewhere. Fish have lateral lines down their side and things like that. But most sense organs do tend to be grouped at the anterior. Now, the big categories are vertebrates and invertebrates. Vertebrates have a backbone. Invertebrates don't have bones in general. There's 35 different phyla of invertebrates. Now, think about the King Philip came over for green stamps or kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species that we did before. So kingdom, phylum, that's just one below. So there's still a lot of things that fit in there, and there's still 35 different phyla of them. So a very diverse group. So we have sponges, one of the simpler life forms going. They are multicellular, they are eukaryotic, they don't have cell walls, they're heterotrophic, all the things that we just said on the first slide that tell you it's an animal. But they certainly don't look like a puppy dog or anything either. They don't have a head per se. They don't have a centralized nervous system. It's diffuse throughout them, it's spread throughout them. So they're very slow to respond, and they don't get up and walk around either. Sponges often provide habitat for other organisms, places for them to live. You can see down the lower left corner down there. These can be fairly sizable organisms with some big openings, so if you have a little fish looking for a place to hide, it's not a bad deal. Cnidarians, no C sound. That's a hard one. That's one of the reasons I have to go through the slide here, because you probably wouldn't pronounce it that way. Soft-bodied carnivorous animals with stinging tentacles, easy for me to say, and specialized tissues. So now we're talking about things that include, for instance, corals and other small organisms. That the stinging tentacles are a big thing here. If you run into these, you really don't appreciate it. So corals, anemones, things like that. Now my dogs are probably going to bark in the background. So here's a pretty one. All right, Cnidaria, nettle animals, stinging animals. So you've got corals and anemones, different types of jellyfish, more jellyfish, more jellyfish. These guys, which look like jellyfish. So no head with eyes and a nose and a mouth like we would think of in some organisms. Soft-bodied. Stinging tentacles are used for paralyzing prey usually, because these guys are not fast to respond, so they have to sting and immobilize their prey, and then they sort of envelop it and gradually break it down and get food from it. Worms also do not have bones, so there's lots of different types of worms. Long, skinny is their way to go. They're a tube within a tube. Food goes in one end, out the other, and processed in the middle. There's different types of worms. There's flatworms, which, as the name sort of implies, are long and not round, but rather flattened. So they're a different shape. Roundworms, smooth, long, skinny spaghetti here. And then you have like your typical earthworms. So you have roundworms, similar to flatworms, but they have the round body cavity. Tube within a tube still. And annelids are your segmented worms. They have individual body parts. If you've ever looked at an earthworm with any detail, you can see individual rings going around to individual little segments. That's what sets them apart. Mollusks. So it's a soft-bodied critter, but now, in order to avoid being soft and squishy and easy to eat, mollusks have some hard parts to them. Usually in the case of like our clam or oyster, things like that, we're going to have a hard shell on the outside and the squishy critter on the inside. Now, that's a process in itself. They live in the water, so they're going to take minerals from the water, be able to process that, and secrete their shell. As they grow, it grows. So the organism is actually using minerals from its environment and secreting them and making its protective case in that situation. So clams, snails, octopi, squid. Now, an octopus or a squid, they don't have a hard outer shell. So they, in that case, don't have the protective shell side of it. They do have a bony beak, and that's about the only hard part of an octopus or a squid. Arthropods, very, very diverse. Of all the living things on the planet, this is about the most diverse group as far as sheer number of species. Segmented bodies. You're going to have a 3-part body plan for the arthropods, and jointed appendages, and a very tough exoskeleton. So things like lobsters, shrimp, and crab would fall into this group if it's a crustacean. Arachnids, you have your spiders, your scorpions, little mites that you're probably not going to see without magnification. Insects, butterflies, beetles, ants, etc. Again, very, very crazy diverse number of critters here, so we have to be kind of general and vague when we're going through the highlights of them, because there's a lot of very distinct characteristics. Insects especially tend to go through a very pronounced life cycle, so they don't look the same their whole existence. So an adult insect will lay an egg, the egg will turn into a larva. The larva does not look like the adult at all. It turns into a pupa, where it then metamorphoses into its adult form. In elementary school, they often, I don't know if they still do, but they used to like to grow butterflies from a larval stage to an adult stage. So you have your caterpillar, goes into the pupa, turns into an adult, kind of the same idea. Flies, you have flies that lay eggs, so you have maggots that then pupate and then turn into adult flies of various types. So that change is metamorphosis. And there's Dr. Zoidberg. All right, so in this category, what do we have? Lobsters, centipedes, scorpions, beetles, ants, crabs, spiders, to name a few. And what they have in common is the head, thorax, and abdomen, the 3-part body plan. Now, it's kind of diverse. They're certainly not all the same by any stretch of the imagination. But you got the head with most of the sensory organs, the abdomen with the digestive portion especially, and usually in the abdomen you also have respiratory function in there, and then the thorax, the tail end of it. All right, echinoderms. Spiny skin, internal skeleton. So now we have an internal skeleton, though it's a really, not a skeleton like you would think of you and I having, but it's internal support structure. So it's an internal skeleton of sorts. Water is the main way of moving things throughout it, and suction cup like feet. So sea stars, urchins, these are echinoderms. So you look at them and you can see the radial symmetry on that fellow. You can see the 5 arms coming off there. There's a sea star. Again, radial symmetry. Bumpy skin. And the tube feet are on the bottom. We don't have a bottom view of it, but they can move around. So now you have some locomotion. They do have that internal skeleton, so that makes them a little bit tougher. And so that's a step forward in complexity when it comes to life forms. Now, the real big step forward, at least in our opinion, would be vertebrates. Vertebrates are one big phylum, so they're all related, but there's a lot of diversity still. There's 5 classes of vertebrates, just to run through them. You have your fish, amphibians, birds, reptiles, and mammals. Those are your 5 classes of vertebrates. And I would think at this point you've probably talked about these before and know a little bit about them at least. But what makes them distinct is the important part. So they're all vertebrates, they're all chordates. Let's talk about the specifics a bit. So a chordate, the general group, is any species that has in at least some stage of its life a hollow nerve cord, so a spinal cord, pharyngeal pouches, another weird word. So we're talking lungs or gills for processing gases, getting oxygen into the circulatory system for respiration to happen. And oftentimes critters will have gills in one part of their life cycle and then lungs in another. That's entirely a feasible thing. So that can change. Tail that extends beyond the anus. And that's often in the embryonic stage. You don't see a lot of people walking around with tails that stick out beyond their anus, but in the embryo stage, humans and other critters do have a tail that sticks out. So let's talk fish first. In the big scheme of things, when organisms were appearing on the planet, when we find them in the fossil record, the first vertebrates to appear in the fossil record are fish. Because as far as we can tell, life began in the oceans. And that makes sense because the water can support, so you don't need a complicated skeleton for the most part. But as soon as you start to come out of the water and onto land, you're guaranteed to need a skeleton. And if you want to get around quickly in the water, having an internal skeleton is a very efficient way to do it, so then you have attachment points for muscles and such. So fish started off simple and got more complex too. There's many types of fish that have come and gone and are extinct now. So early fish were jawless fish, didn't have jaws. Most modern fish do. There are still a few jawless fish, but not many. But most fish do have jaws at this point. They have fins, they have gills. Now, the fin structure is different within that particular group. I mean, it all depends, again, on what type of lifestyle this fish is going to live. Is it a predator? Is it slow moving? Does it have to be maneuverable? So the fins are going to take a different arrangement depending on that particular critter. So again, being really vague and really fast, I wish we had more time to talk about it and break it down. If you're really interested in these different types of animals, you might want to consider taking zoology next year where you talk more about animals. But little fish are going to eat other little fish. They might clean algae off from rocks. They're going to eat protozoas and things like that. So micro, tiny organisms, plankton and water. Bigger fish tend to eat other fish. Not always the case, but that's a pretty common way to do it. Some things filter out food as well. So most of these are all freshwater fish showing up here. But we're familiar with freshwater fish mainly in our neck of the woods simply because we have the Great Lakes. Though freshwater versus saltwater, I mean, different body chemistry and whatnot to deal with the saltwater, but body structures aren't all that different. Amphibians. So amphibians, their big claim to fame here is they have a kind of a two-part life cycle. They live part of their lives in the water, usually the larval stage. So if we're talking about frogs, for instance, the tadpole stage. Salamanders have a larval stage as well. So part of their life cycle is in the water, parts on land, because as juveniles, they usually have gills, and as adults, after they metamorphose, they have lungs, so that allows them to come out of the water and breathe air. Now, one interesting thing about amphibians is the fact that their skin is actually part of the respiratory system. Most amphibians, some people don't like them because they're kind of cold and slimy, and that's because they have to keep their skin damp in order for oxygen exchange to occur through it. So it's part of the deal. They don't want to dry out, so they naturally have that kind of cool, slimy texture. So the life stages in amphibians, excuse me, look very different. If you look at a tadpole, you don't automatically say, oh yeah, that's definitely this frog, because there are differences in the tadpoles, but they certainly don't look like their adult form. Same with, around here, salamanders are a pretty common one that you'll run into. Being a colder climate, can't say we're the most amphibian-rich environment. There's a lot of diversity in the frog and toad kingdom or groups, but especially in tropical climates, you can have even more so. So, redback salamander, little tree frog with its pouch, open in the springtime. If you live near a wet area or woods, you hear that trilling sound. That's these little frogs and toads. Hellbenders. So lots of diversity. Again, wish we had more time to spend a week or two just talking about this topic, but moving right along. Reptiles. So now reptiles and amphibians are not exactly the same thing. They kind of get grouped up in the general consciousness of people, but they're definitely different. So we have a vertebrate that has dry, scaly skin. That's the most obvious physical difference there. Lungs, and tends to lay eggs on land. So here's a big difference. Amphibian eggs are very soft and jelly, squishy. They have to be in water, where reptiles lay their eggs on land. They still have a leathery skin. It's not like a hard eggshell typically. So your turtles and your crocodiles and alligators are going to have a leathery skin that they lay on land in a nest of sorts, or in the case of turtles and tortoises, maybe in the sand. Most reptiles are cold-blooded. Dinosaurs, there's still a lot of debate about that. Given their sheer body size, it's pretty likely that dinosaurs were warm-blooded, but there's still some debate, given that we can't go back in time. It's hard to tell. Can't stick a thermometer up a T-Rex's butt. But most modern reptiles, at least, are cold-blooded. So when it's warm, they're more active, and when it's cold, they're less active. So like alligators and crocodiles, well, in the southern U.S., let's just say alligators, they're going to be more active in the summer months. In the winter, in Florida, they might be able to be fairly active still, but if it's further up, at the edge of their range where it gets cooler, they're going to chill out, quite literally, when it's cooler, slow down their respiratory process, slow down their metabolism, and when it warms up again, they'll fire back up. Here in northern New York, we have a fair turtle population, and they will go dormant for the wintertime, kind of go deep down, go dormant, and bury themselves until it warms up, because there's just not enough warmth for them to metabolize in the wintertime. Birds. So more and more as we do genetic analysis, we're starting to realize that birds and reptiles are very close from a evolutionary standpoint. So they have feathers and wings, and there's evidence now that a lot of the dinosaurs had feathers and some had wings. They are warm-blooded. This is a definite on this one, always warm-blooded. So they have to maintain a constant internal body temperature, where if it's cold-blooded, it goes along with the temperature of its surroundings. Legs are covered in scales, modified for walking or perching. And the more and more we look at the skeletal structural similarities, we can see how, in some cases at least, dinosaurs turned into birds. So there was an evolutionary change toward that. So birds are unique in their sheer diversity as well. I don't know if it's unique, but they are diverse. Everything from the tiniest little hummingbird that weighs no more than a couple of quarters to some pretty big owls and falcons and condors and vultures of sorts that could easily have a wingspan bigger than your average person. So a great deal of diversity, very specialized for the habitat they're in and the role that they play. Some are seed eaters, other birds are carnivores and eat other birds or rodents and such. So the diversity is going to come about from the role they play in their environment and how they get food and live out their lives. Mammals. Hey, finally does. So mammals are animals that have hair or fur, mammary glands for milk. They are warm-blooded, they breathe air, and they have internal development of their young. So when they give birth to the young, they are going to be more ready to function. Now, that being said, there is an exception to that. So we have placental mammals. The young is nourished inside the mother until they are fully developed, which honestly is the majority of mammals. Marsupials, which Australia tends to be large on these, though they're not exclusive there. The young are nourished inside a pouch after a certain stage of development. So they'll give birth to very immature young, enough where they can crawl up to the pouch, find a nipple, and then hang out there and finish their development. Now, monotremes. Monotremes, for all you Phineas and Ferb fans from back in the day, platypus would be a monotreme. Weird mammals found in Australia. They lay eggs instead of bearing live young. This is the only mammal that's going to do that, but it still counts as a mammal. It gives milk, so milk, hair, all that. It just happens to lay eggs, so it's a odd branch of the family tree. So bats are mammals, bears, cats, fishers, wolverines, whales. Whales are mammals, so there are marine mammals. A possum, an elephant, Steve Jobs, well, he was. All right, so that's the highlights. By no means did we do a great job and cover every little detail. Zoology is the study of animals, and really, we could spend a lifetime just talking about the diversity here. So this is the highlights. If there's anything that interests you particularly, by all means, this is where you're going to want to look it up, investigate it, and hopefully we'll have time to talk about it at some other date. Thanks for watching.